My name is Claire. I was 34 years old when I woke up from a grueling 8-hour tumor removal surgery to find my hospital room completely empty. There were no flowers. There was no mother holding my hand. And my husband, Greg, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the nurse handed me my phone. I had a single text message from my husband that read, "Your parents and I finalized the sale of the house today. The money is going to your brother's company. Don't bother coming back to our address." They left me bleeding and stitched up in a hospital bed, thinking they had just stripped me of everything. They had absolutely no idea that the house they just stole was legally rigged to financially annihilate them. Waking up from general anesthesia is not like waking up from a deep sleep. It is a violent, disorienting crawl out of a dark, suffocating abyss. The very first thing I registered was the rhythmic, piercing beep of the heart monitor next to my bed. Then came the physical agony. It felt as though someone had poured crushed glass down my throat, a side effect of the breathing tube they had snaked down my trachea while the surgical team carefully excised a mass from the base of my neck. I couldn't move my head. Thick, tight bandages wrapped around my throat and shoulders, pinning me to the stiff hospital mattress. The air smelled of harsh iodine and stale bleach. I blinked against the blinding, sterile glare of the fluorescent lights above me. I tried to turn my head to the right, expecting to see Greg sitting in the vinyl visitor's chair. I expected him to be holding my hand the way a husband is supposed to when his wife has just survived a life-threatening procedure. I expected my mother, Patricia, to be fussing over the blankets. The chair was empty. The room was silent. I managed to press the red call button taped to my bed rail. A few moments later, a young nurse with kind, tired eyes walked in. When she looked at me, I didn't see the professional, reassuring smile of a medical worker. I saw profound, uncomfortable pity. "Where is my husband?" I croaked, my voice sounding like tearing paper. The nurse shifted her weight uncomfortably. She reached over to the rolling tray table beside my bed and picked up my smartphone. "He left about an hour into your procedure, honey. He told the surgical coordinator he had urgent business to attend to. He said to give you this." She placed the cold metal of the phone into my trembling palm. I unlocked the screen. There was no missed call, no voicemail asking if I was alive. Just that single, perfectly punctuated text message sitting in my inbox. "Your parents and I finalized the sale of the house today. The money is going to your brother's company. Don't bother coming back to our address." I stared at the glowing pixels until they blurred together. I closed my eyes, and my mind instantly went to the timeline. They didn't just leave. While I was unconscious on an operating table, while a surgeon held a scalpel millimeters from my spinal cord, the man I had vowed to spend my life with was sitting in a notary's office with my mother, signing away the magnificent $1.5 million modern colonial home that I had bought and paid for with my own money. They had waited for the exact moment I was physically incapacitated, literally cut open and bleeding, to execute their heist. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The anesthesia was still pumping through my veins, wrapping my emotions in a thick layer of fog. But beneath that fog, a different kind of coldness settled into my bones. The nurse asked if I wanted her to call a social worker, her voice laced with deep concern. I slowly opened my eyes, looked at her, and shook my head. "No," I whispered. "Just bring me my laptop, please." Before I show you how I turned my treacherous husband and my toxic family into federal debtors without ever getting out of my ICU bed, take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment down below. Where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I read every single one. To understand how a woman wakes up completely abandoned in a hospital and chooses a laptop over tears, you have to understand the fundamental toxic architecture of my bloodline. I grew up in an affluent suburb of Boston, raised by a woman whose love was entirely, brutally transactional. My mother, Patricia, didn't view children as human beings. She viewed them as an investment portfolio. She was a woman who practically bathed in Chanel No. 5 and wore her country club status like a suit of armor. In her eyes, there were only two roles a person could play: the trophy or the bank. My older brother, Derek, was the trophy. Derek was the quintessential golden child. He was charismatic, conventionally handsome, and possessed the kind of breathtaking, unearned arrogance that allowed him to fail upward his entire life. Derek was a serial entrepreneur, which is simply the polite, corporate term for a man who burns through other people's money without ever turning a profit. I was the bank. I was deeply introverted, hyper-focused, and possessed a mind that understood complex systems better than human emotions. By the time I was 28, I was a senior software architect for a major tech firm, earning a salary that my mother viewed as a communal family asset. For years, I was systematically conditioned to believe that my only value to my family was my financial utility. If Derek needed bailout money for a failed crypto startup, my mother would call me, crying, manipulating my guilt until I transferred the funds. If I refused, she would freeze me out, ignoring my birthdays and holidays until I submitted. I thought I could escape the cycle when I met Greg. Greg was a wealth manager at a mid-tier firm. When we first met, he seemed like my safe harbor. He wore perfectly tailored charcoal suits, smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood, and actually listened to me. When I talked about the suffocating pressure my family put on me, he would hold me, kiss the top of my head, and promise that we would build a fortress together. I thought I had finally found a man who would protect me from the emotional vampires I shared a last name with. I didn't realize that sometimes vampires wear Armani. The shift in our marriage didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, insidious creep of gaslighting and manipulation. About a year into our marriage, Derek came to us with yet another brilliant pitch for a logistics app. He needed $250,000 in seed money. I immediately said no. I was exhausted from funding his delusions. That night, Greg sat on the edge of our plush California king bed, unbuttoning his French cuffs. He looked at me with a soft, disappointed sigh. "Claire, I really think you're being too harsh on your brother," Greg said, his voice dripping with fake empathy. "Derek just needs this one push to get off the ground. You make so much money, and we live in a massive house. Don't be so stingy with your own blood. Your mother is sick with worry. Family is everything, Claire. We have to support them." I stared at my husband, feeling a strange, unsettling twist in my gut. He wasn't defending me. He was repeating Patricia's exact talking points. Over the next 2 years, Greg slowly, methodically dismantled my boundaries. Every time my mother demanded money, Greg would side with her. He made me feel like I was crazy, selfish, and cold-hearted for wanting to keep the money I worked 80 hours a week to earn. I didn't know it then, but Greg wasn't just taking my mother's side. He was actively auditioning for her. He had realized that extracting money from a brilliant, isolated woman was much easier if you teamed up with the woman who installed her trauma buttons in the first place. The realization that I was entirely surrounded by parasites didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation. It arrived silently on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks before my surgery. 6 months prior, I had started getting brutal, blinding headaches. My vision would blur, and my hands would shake. After a barrage of MRIs and terrified visits to specialists, I was diagnosed with a meningioma, a tumor pressing against the base of my brain. It was non-cancerous, but its location made it incredibly dangerous. If it wasn't removed, it would eventually cause permanent paralysis or death. The surgery was scheduled and the survival rate was high, but the procedure was incredibly invasive. I was terrified. I needed my husband. I needed to know that someone was going to hold my hand, tell me I was going to wake up, and protect me while I was unconscious. Greg played the role of the devoted, terrified husband flawlessly. He went to every consultation, nodding solemnly while the neurosurgeon explained the risks of general anesthesia and the long, painful recovery process. He held my hand in the waiting rooms, rubbing his thumb over my knuckles. He told me he loved me more than anything. 2 weeks before I was set to go under the knife, I was sitting in my home office, trying to finalize my team's projects before I went on medical leave. Greg had gone to the gym and left his iPad charging on the kitchen counter. I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The iPad screen lit up with a notification. I normally wouldn't have looked. I wasn't the kind of wife who checked her husband's devices, but the notification banner wasn't a standard text message. It was from a group chat titled Phase 2. The message was from my mother, Patricia. Make sure she signs the POA tonight. If she questions the wording, just tell her it's standard hospital protocol. Derek's investors are pulling out. We need the liquid cash from the house by Friday. I froze. The glass of water slipped from my hand and shattered on the Italian tile floor. The sound didn't even register in my brain. I picked up the iPad. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the sleek metal tablet. My thumb hovered over the screen, and then, with a sick feeling rising in my throat, I opened the group chat. There were 3 people in the chat: my mother, my brother, Derek, and my husband, Greg. I scrolled up, my eyes scanning months of messages. The sheer, calculated cruelty of their words made my vision swim. They hadn't just been talking about Derek's failing business. They had been discussing my medical diagnosis like it was a strategic business opportunity. Derek, May 12. If she's out of commission for 6 months recovering, she won't be able to track the accounts. Greg, how fast can we liquidate the equity in the house? Greg, May 14. I've already spoken to the broker. We can push a fast-track sale to an all-cash buyer, but I need her signature on the deed transfer. She's getting suspicious when I bring up finances. Patricia, June Sao. Use the surgery, Greg. Tell her the hospital requires a comprehensive power of attorney and asset management transfer in case she ends up in a coma. She's terrified right now. She won't read the fine print. As soon as she's under anesthesia, execute the power of attorney. We sell the house, Derek gets his funding, and Greg, you get your 30% cut. She'll be too weak to fight us in court when she wakes up. I stood in my pristine $1 million kitchen, reading the digital blueprint of my own execution. They weren't just going to steal my money. They were going to use my terror, my vulnerability, and the very real possibility that I might not survive a brain surgery as the weapon to do it. The man who kissed me every night, the mother who birthed me, and the brother I had bailed out a dozen times were actively counting down the days until I was unconscious so they could strip me to the bone. Most people, upon discovering something like this, would scream. They would throw the iPad at the wall, pack a bag, and call a divorce lawyer. They would confront the monsters living in their house. I didn't do any of that. When you spend your entire life as the bank, you learn to process emotion like a ledger. Anger is a liability. Panic is a vulnerability. As I stood among the shattered glass on the kitchen floor, my heartbreak rapidly, terrifyingly, crystallized into pure, absolute ice. I carefully locked the iPad and placed it exactly where I found it. I cleaned up the broken glass. I went back to my home office, closed the door, and locked it. I did not confront my husband when he came home from the gym. I greeted him with a soft, tired smile. I let him kiss my forehead. I let him hold me while I pretended to cry about the impending surgery. I played the role of the terrified, submissive wife perfectly because I knew that if I tipped my hand even a fraction of an inch, they would find another way to ruin me. The next morning, while Greg was at work, I didn't go to my tech firm. I drove into downtown Boston and walked into the sterile, intimidating glass offices of a corporate litigation and real estate attorney named Sterling. Sterling wasn't a family lawyer who handled messy divorces. He was a corporate shark who specialized in hostile takeovers, asset protection, and crushing people with the sheer weight of federal law. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and told him everything. I didn't cry. I simply laid out the facts, the text messages, and the timeline of my impending surgery. Sterling listened quietly, steepling his fingers. When I finished, he didn't offer me pity. He offered me a predatory grin. "They want the house," Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "Your home is fully paid off. It's an unencumbered asset worth $1.5 million. They plan to use the fraudulent power of attorney to transfer the deed to themselves, sell it to a cash buyer, and distribute the funds while you are incapacitated." "Yes," I replied, my voice dead calm. "Can we stop them from getting the power of attorney?" "We could," Sterling said, leaning forward. "We could file an injunction right now. You could divorce your husband today and lock the assets in a freeze. But that would just result in a long, messy, expensive legal battle. They would drag it out for years. Is that what you want?" I looked Sterling dead in the eye. "I don't want to fight them, Mr. Sterling. I want to annihilate them. I want them to take the house, and I want it to destroy them." Sterling's grin widened. Then we don't stop the transfer. We make the asset toxic. Over the next 2 weeks, while I played the role of the frail, terrified wife at home, Sterling and I constructed a legal and financial trap so complex, so flawlessly executed, that it would make a Wall Street hedge fund manager weep. Here is the brilliant, devastating reality of commercial real estate law. You cannot sell a property that has a lien attached to it without satisfying the debt first. And if you knowingly accept the transfer of a deed that is burdened by a corporate lien, you do not just take the house. You legally, personally, assume the debt attached to it. I already owned a private holding company, a shell LLC I had set up years ago to manage some of my tech patents. It was completely separated from my personal finances and heavily insulated from my marriage. Sterling and I used this LLC to execute the poison pill. My holding company took out a massive, highly toxic commercial loan of $3 million from a ruthless private equity firm. The terms of the loan were brutal: astronomical interest rates, immediate default penalties, an absolute lack of forgiveness. What did we use as collateral for this $3 million loan? My $1.5 million house. I quietly, legally attached a $3 million corporate lien directly to the physical deed of my own home. To anyone looking at the surface, the house was a gold mine. But underneath the paperwork, it was a ticking financial nuclear bomb. The night before my surgery, Greg came into our bedroom. He was holding a sleek leather folder. His face was a mask of grave, husbandly concern. He sat on the edge of the bed and took my hand. "Claire, sweetheart," Greg said softly, his thumb tracing my knuckles. "The hospital called today. They need us to finalize the emergency contact forms and the medical power of attorney. It's just standard procedure, given the risks of the anesthesia. If something happens and you're in a coma, I need the legal authority to manage our assets to pay for your long-term care." He slid the paperwork out of the folder and handed me a pen. I looked at the documents. They were thick, filled with dense, intimidating legalese. They weren't just medical forms. Buried in the pages was a complete, irrevocable transfer of deed, granting Greg and my mother joint ownership and full authority to liquidate the property. My heart hammered in my chest, not from fear, but from the sheer, staggering adrenaline of watching a predator step willingly into a bear trap. I looked up at Greg, letting my eyes fill with authentic tears of terror, not for the surgery, but for the man sitting in front of me. "Greg, I'm so scared. Promise me you'll take care of me. Promise me you won't leave me alone." Greg leaned down and kissed my forehead, his lips cold against my skin. "I promise, Claire. I'll be right here when you wake up. I'll take care of everything. Just sign here, here, and here." I took the pen. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name on the dotted lines, legally handing them the keys to their own destruction. The next morning, I was prepped for surgery. The neurosurgeon came in, reviewed the charts, and patted my shoulder. The anesthesiologist pushed the cold, heavy liquid into my IV line. I looked around the prep room. Greg was standing by the door, texting furiously on his phone. He didn't even look up as my eyes rolled back and the darkness pulled me under. Which brings us right back to the empty, sterile hospital room. I was sitting in my hospital bed, the sharp, agonizing pain in my neck throbbing with every heartbeat. The nurse had just handed me my laptop. I opened it, my hands shaking slightly from the residual anesthesia, and logged into my encrypted email server. I had a message from Sterling. It contained a single, scanned PDF document and a brief note. The transfer was executed at 11:45 a.m. The property sale to the cash buyer was finalized at 2 p.m. The trap is sprung, awaiting your command. I opened the PDF. It was the final notarized deed transfer. Greg and Patricia had officially, legally assumed ownership of the house while I was bleeding on the operating table. They had rushed the sale to an all-cash buyer for $1.5 million, desperate to get the liquid cash into Derek's failing company before I woke up. They thought they had just made $1.5 million. They thought they had left me with nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't call Greg to scream at him. I didn't call my mother to ask her how she could betray her own daughter. I picked up my cell phone, ignoring the text message Greg had sent abandoning me, and dialed Sterling's direct line. He answered on the first ring. "They signed it," I croaked, my voice a brutal, tearing rasp. "Execute the debt collection." "Consider it done, Claire," Sterling replied, his voice humming with predatory satisfaction. "Rest well. The fireworks begin tomorrow." I closed my laptop, leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, and closed my eyes. The pain in my neck was agonizing, but the absolute chilling peace settling over my soul was the strongest painkiller I had ever felt. The celebration happened at Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive, astronomically expensive French restaurants in the city. I wasn't there, of course. I was lying in a private luxury recovery suite that Sterling had arranged, hooked up to an IV, sipping lukewarm broth. But I knew exactly what they were doing because Derek, in his infinite, arrogant stupidity, had posted a video on his public Instagram story. I watched the video on my phone. Greg, Patricia, and Derek were sitting at a private table in the restaurant's wine cellar room. The table was covered in empty oyster shells and Wagyu beef. Greg was holding up a bottle of Dom Perignon, his face flushed with triumph. Patricia was beaming, looking at Derek like he was a conquering hero. "To the future," Greg laughed, raising his glass to the camera, "to funding the vision, and to new beginnings." They clinked their glasses. They were celebrating my absolute ruin. They were celebrating the $1.5 million sitting in Derek's corporate bank account, the money from the expedited cash sale of my house. I watched the video loop 3 times. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold, clinical anticipation of a sniper waiting for the target to walk into the crosshairs. The crosshairs aligned exactly 12 hours later. It was 10 a.m. on a Thursday. Greg was sitting in his corner office at his wealth management firm. According to the frantic, hysterical voicemails he left on my phone later that day, he was in the middle of a meeting with a high-net-worth client when his personal cell phone rang. It was a representative from Apex Capital Group, the ruthless private equity firm that held the $3 million toxic lien on the house. "Mr. Gregory Vance?" the representative asked, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "I am calling regarding the property located at my address. Our records indicate that a transfer of deed and subsequent sale of the property was executed yesterday afternoon." "Yes, that's correct," Greg said, likely puffing his chest out, trying to sound authoritative in front of his client. "The sale is finalized. The funds have been dispersed. Is there a problem?" "There is a significant problem, Mr. Vance," the representative stated coldly. "The property you transferred into your name and subsequently sold was collateral for a primary corporate lien of $3 million. Because you and Patricia Vance knowingly executed the deed transfer without satisfying the primary lien, you have legally assumed personal liability for the debt." I imagine the color drained from Greg's face instantly. I imagine his client watching as the confident wealth manager suddenly began to tremble. What lien?" Greg stammered, the reality of the situation not fully piercing his arrogance yet. "There was no lien on the house. The house was paid off." "Our records and the county clerk's records disagree," the representative countered smoothly. "The lien was attached 6 months ago. By executing the transfer of deed, you assumed the debt. By selling the property and dispersing the funds without notifying the primary lien holder, you have committed severe financial fraud. We have already initiated asset seizure protocols." Wait, Greg shouted, standing up from his desk. "The sale was for $1.5 million. Even if there was a lien, we don't have $3 million. "We are aware, Mr. Vance. Therefore, to satisfy the immediate default penalties of the remaining $1.5 million, our legal team has just executed a federal freeze on all of your personal and joint bank accounts. We have also frozen the accounts of Patricia Vance, your co-signer on the deed. Furthermore, we have contacted the federal authorities regarding the fraudulent disbursement of funds to Derek Vance's corporate entity. Have a pleasant day." The line went dead. At the exact same moment, across town, Patricia was at the checkout counter of a luxury boutique trying to buy a $4,000 Chanel handbag to celebrate her son's new funding. Her black Amex card was declined. She tried another card. Declined. She tried her debit card. Account frozen. Contact your institution immediately. And Derek? Derek was sitting in his leased office space trying to wire the $1.5 million to offshore accounts to hide it, but the money was already gone. The federal fraud investigators, tipped off by Sterling, had placed a hard lock on his corporate accounts pending an investigation into money laundering and receipt of fraudulently obtained funds. The house of cards didn't just collapse, it detonated. At 2:00 p.m., the door to my private hospital recovery suite burst open. Greg stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who had just been dragged behind a truck. His expensive charcoal suit was rumpled. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled. The smooth, charming wealth manager was entirely gone, replaced by a sweating, hyperventilating, terrified animal. He rushed to the side of my bed, his eyes wild. He didn't ask how my surgery went. He didn't ask if I was in pain. "Claire!" he gasped, gripping the bed rail so hard his knuckles turned white. "Claire, what did you do? What did you do to the house?" I slowly turned my head to look at him. My neck throbbed agonizingly, but I didn't wince. I looked at the man who had abandoned me while I was bleeding, the man who had plotted my execution via group chat. "I don't know what you're talking about, Greg," I whispered, my voice still a tearing rasp from the breathing tube. "I've been in a hospital bed. You told me you sold the house. You told me not to come back." "The bank," Greg screamed, his voice cracking, spit flying from his lips. He was losing his mind. "A private equity firm just froze all my accounts. They froze your mother's accounts. They said there was a $3 million lien on the house. They said because your mother and I signed the deed transfer, we owe them $1.5 million. Claire, tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you can fix this." I reached over to my bedside table. I picked up my phone, unlocked the screen, and pulled up the group chat that I had screenshot from his iPad weeks ago, the chat titled Phase 2. I turned the screen toward him. I watched his eyes scan the words he had typed. "Patricia, June 7th. Use the surgery, Greg. Tell her the hospital requires a comprehensive power of attorney. She'll be too weak to fight us in court when she wakes up." Greg stared at the glowing screen. The remaining color vanished from his face. He staggered back a step, releasing the bed rail as if it had burned him. "You wanted the house, Greg," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper. "You wanted to strip me to the bone while I was under anesthesia. I just let you do it." "You set us up," Greg breathed, the horror of his own arrogance finally crushing him. "You attached the debt to the deed. You knew we were going to steal it. You knew we would sign the transfer." "I knew," I confirmed coldly. "I hope Derek's startup can generate $3 million by Friday, Greg, because if it can't, the IRS and the federal fraud investigators are going to seize your mother's retirement accounts. And considering you facilitated a fraudulent sale using your credentials as a wealth manager, I imagine the SEC will be permanently revoking your license by the end of the month." Greg fell to his knees. Literally, physically collapsed onto the sterile linoleum floor of the hospital room. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob. Deep, racking, pathetic sobs. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. "Get out of my room, Greg," I said, "and don't bother coming back to my address." I pressed the red call button on my bed rail. When the nurse walked in a few seconds later, she stopped short, staring at the weeping man on the floor. "Nurse," I said, my voice steady despite the searing pain in my throat. "This man is making me uncomfortable. He is not my husband. Please have security remove him." Greg looked up, his face red and slick with tears. He opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, absolute emptiness in my eyes stopped him. He knew he had lost. He knew I held all the cards, and I was not going to negotiate. He slowly stood up, looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant man he had been just yesterday, and stumbled out of the room. I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me. The surgery had removed the physical tumor from my neck, but the trap I had sprung had removed the cancer from my life. The fallout over the next 6 months was spectacular, agonizingly slow and heavily documented in federal court records. Because Greg and Patricia had signed the deed transfer before initiating the sale, they were legally, personally responsible for the remaining $1.5 million debt to Apex Capital Group. And because they had immediately disbursed the $1.5 million in cash from the sale to Derek's LLC without notifying the primary lien holder, they had committed severe federal-level financial fraud. The consequences were absolute. Greg's firm fired him the moment the SEC investigation was announced. He lost his wealth management license permanently. His personal bank accounts, his investments, and his 401k were seized to satisfy the debt. He tried to claim he was manipulated by my mother, but his signature was on the documents and the digital footprint of the Phase 2 group chat, which Sterling legally subpoenaed and submitted into evidence, proved he was a willing, eager conspirator. He is currently facing potential prison time for wire fraud. Patricia, the woman who viewed her children as financial assets, was stripped of everything. Apex Capital foreclosed on her pristine, multi-million-dollar suburban home. They seized her retirement accounts. The country club socialite was forced to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment, her reputation completely annihilated. Her friends abandoned her the moment the fraud investigation became public knowledge. Derek, the golden child, the brilliant entrepreneur, panicked. When the federal investigators froze his LLC's bank accounts, he realized he was going down for money laundering. He attempted to flee the state, but his assets were locked. He is currently living with Patricia in her tiny apartment, working as a shift manager at an electronics store to pay his criminal defense lawyers. They tried to call me. They left dozens of voicemails, ranging from furious, screaming threats to pathetic, weeping pleas for mercy. Patricia begged me to call off the lawyers, claiming she was just trying to help her son. I never answered a single call. I never replied to a single email. I let the silence and the crushing weight of the federal government be my only response. As for me, I recovered. It was a slow, painful process. The physical healing took months of physical therapy. I had to learn how to turn my head without pain, how to sleep without waking up terrified. But the psychological healing was instantaneous. My divorce from Greg was finalized quickly. Because the house was legally sold and the remaining debt was assumed by Greg and Patricia prior to the divorce filing, I walked away with zero liability. Furthermore, because I had insulated my true wealth, my tech patents, my actual savings, and my stock portfolios in blind trusts months before the surgery, Greg couldn't touch a dime of it in the settlement. He walked away with half of a checking account that contained less than $3,000. I didn't stay in Boston. The city held too many ghosts. I moved to a quiet, beautiful coastal town in Oregon. I bought a stunning, modern glass house overlooking the ocean. I didn't need a massive $1.5 million colonial to prove my worth anymore. I work remotely now, designing software architecture on my own terms. Looking back at the nightmare, the most profound lesson I learned wasn't about financial law or corporate liens. It was a lesson about betrayal trauma and radical acceptance. When you grow up as the bank for a toxic family, you are conditioned to believe that your vulnerability is a liability. You are taught that if you show weakness, if you get sick, if you need help, you will be exploited. Greg, Patricia, and Derek proved that my deepest fears were entirely justified. They looked at a woman facing a life-threatening brain surgery and saw nothing but a ticking clock and a payday. But I also learned that vulnerability does not equal powerlessness. You can be terrified, you can be bleeding, you can be physically incapacitated, and you can still be the most dangerous person in the room. You do not have to scream or fight or beg toxic people to love you. You just have to accept them for exactly who they are. Radical acceptance means looking at the monster in your house, refusing to make excuses for them, and quietly building the trap that will end them. If you are listening to this and you are surrounded by people who view your success as their personal ATM, or people who use your moments of weakness to extract what they want, hear me now. Do not confront them. Do not try to reason with parasites. They do not care about your pain. They only care about their access to your resources. Smile. Play the role they expect you to play. Let them think you are weak. Let them think they are outsmarting you. And in the silence, in the dark, build your fortress. Hire the lawyer. Move the money. Change the locks. Protect yourself with absolute, ruthless precision. Because when the trap finally springs, and they realize that the person they thought they were destroying was actually the architect of their ruin, you won't need to say a word. Their own greed will do all the talking. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if it validated your own experiences with toxic families, or if you simply appreciate the cold, precise beauty of corporate karma, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let them see you coming. I will see you in the next story.